Today is January 25th, 2020, and my name is Teresa, Santalucia, and I'm on the Hanson Historical Commission. And part of the 200th anniversary, we are conducting some oral histories with some of the distinguished members of the Hanson community. And we're taking this opportunity to meet some of those Hansonites who have lived in Hanson and might be able to share with us some interesting facts about their time in Hanson. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our guest, and if you could just introduce yourself and tell us when and where you were born.
Sure. I'm Phil Clemons. I was born on November 8th, 1951. Family lived at 417 High Street in Hanson. I was one of the Clemons kids that was born in a hospital, not at home, like some of the older ones. But my parents were David and Lucy Clemons, and I had 7 siblings: Paul, Alan, Richard, Charlotte, Sharon, Brian, and Joel. And of the 8 of us, 7 of us still live in Hanson.
Which is amazing. And how long has your family lived in Hanson before that?
Well, my father's side is the new side. They have only been around for about 4 generations. My great-grandfather came to Hanson somewhere around 1900. And on my mother's side, the Keene family, they and their ilk, the Phillipses and others, were around since, I believe, around 1711. So that's probably 10 or more generations.
Okay. And can you give me a little bit of information about the schools that you attended when you grew up in Hanson?
Well, yes. As a matter of fact, when I started school, it was actually kindergarten, and kindergarten was still private then. There was no public kindergarten in the 1950s. And I actually started at age 3 because I had an older cousin, and my aunt thought, oh, wouldn't it be nice if they both went to kindergarten at the same time? So I did kindergarten twice. I didn't stay back. I just got the benefit of 2 years. But it was the Happy Days Kindergarten down on Reed Street. And Vicki Carey ran that. That was kind of terrific. And then for first, second, and third grades, I went to the Washington Street School, which, by the way, was the first non-wooden school the town of Hanson ever built back around 1924. But in 1957, I started there, and first and second grades were in the main building. Third grade was in a little building off to the side we called the Portable. It was like a one-room, standalone school. It was great, the best year of school.
Was it this building?
No, but it was about that same size and shape, but it was newer construction. Mm-hmm. But this building here performed the same function down at Elzey Thomas, because Elzey Thomas and Washington Street were like mirror images of each other. Mm-hmm. And as growth occurred, each one needed an auxiliary room. So this was the one down at Elzey Thomas. But that took care of things for a while, because in the 50s and early 60s, Hanson was growing fast. Then I went from 4th grade to 8th grade to Indian Head School. And while I was there the first year, it was so crowded, our 4th grade class was actually in the end of the cafeteria, just walled off by a row of chalkboards. And we could look out the window and see them building the addition to the Indian Head School. And that was even before the McQuon School was built. But anyway, I was there through 8th grade. That was fine. And then 4 years at Whitman Hanson Regional High School before that had any additions, and when it was still relatively new. Mm-hmm. And of course, we now know it's gone.
Great. So now you, after high school, what did you do after that?
Well, I ended up going to the University of Bridgeport in Connecticut for 4 years. I majored first in physics and then in biology, and then after that I came back home and commuted to graduate school. I went to UMass Dartmouth back when it was called Southeastern Massachusetts University, or SMU, always getting mixed up with the other SMU. But I ended up getting a master's in marine biology. But my whole interest in the biological and life sciences basically stemmed from growing up in a terrific environment, which Hanson had. And that was really the starting point for everything. I probably learned as much outside of school as in it.
Can you tell us a little bit about that, we've heard some stories from your brother who talked a little bit about growing up in Hanson and some of the places that he spent his time. But can you tell us a little bit about your experience in Hanson growing up?
Sure. We lived on High Street, which was right across the street from the fire tower, which is still there. That actually is the third tower on that piece of property. The state has had to keep making them taller as trees grew. But as we were growing up, it was all about, at first, our world was small. It was all about the gardens and the farm animals that we had and the woods in the neighborhood. And it was a great place to grow up. As we get older, we could roam further on foot and bicycle through the woods and down to the ponds and the cranberry bogs. And it was, there was no end of things to be interested in. And of course, my family encouraged that. And I remember when I was probably about 5 or 6 years old, my father took me for a walk in the woods right around Thanksgiving. And it was down near the area where the town now has its wells. There was a spring there. There still is a spring, but it's dry, unfortunately.
So off of what street, just to be
off
more
of
specific?
Franklin Street.
Okay.
The well site that we call the Crystal Spring well field. There was a beautiful old stoned-in spring. It was what they called a boiling spring because the water would just naturally come up out of the sand, the white sand on the bottom, and look like it was boiling, but of course it's cold, and flow out into a little brook. And there were native brook trout spawning in that stream. Then it was just a beautiful image. And maybe partly for that reason, my specialty was fish. But we had a lot of things to be interested in, and a lot of chores around the gardens and things. And it's the difficulty with starting on that is I'll never stop telling you the stories. But we had sheep and chickens and so on. In fact, the family always had sheep in my experience. And I think one little fun fact is when your grandfather came to Hanson and started with sheep, I think his first flock, my father actually, with the truck for his hydro business, delivered that small flock of sheep from the Whitman train station to West Washington Street. I think they were Columbia
sheep. That's right.
And so all the farmers used to know each other.
Yeah, yeah. You know, one thing that strikes me is when I've had a couple of these interviews and people talk about their childhood in Hanson, they are talking quite a bit about bicycling around, which we don't see very much of anymore in Hanson. Did you feel like you as a child had kind of free rein to explore? And
well, you say free rein. The term they use now, which is correct, we were free range children.
Yeah.
Let them out in the morning and make sure they come home in the evening or something like that. But on our bicycles, there was a lot less traffic then, and it wasn't as dangerous. My peak distances, some of my friends and I, we rode as far as Cohasset or down to Plymouth or down to Lake Nipponicket in Bridgewater. Mostly it was much shorter distances, but the world was ours, and we knew how to navigate through it, and it was great.
Yeah. So now you after college you came back to Hanson. What brought you back to Hanson?
Well, I had been commuting to grad school, so in that sense I hadn't left really. And the work that I found turned out to be not so much marine biology as land-based. And I started working down at a lab near Fall River. And in the meantime, I was engaged, and my wife-to-be, Jane Howard from Spring Street, we were making plans. And she was teaching. Not only did she grow up in Hanson, but her first teaching job for 8 years was in Hanson. She taught at the McQuon School. And so we're just very local people. It's in our genes, I guess. And
how did you meet your wife?
Well, when I met her, I had no idea what the future would hold. But no word of a lie, 5th grade one day, I was sitting there in class and thinking to myself, sort of idly wondering, gee, I wonder if there's any chance I might know the person that someday I'll marry, knowing that I wouldn't know.
Yeah.
Well, she was about 2 rows over. But in high school, all of a sudden, one year it came to pass, there was a junior prom, and I needed a date. And I said, well, I know someone to ask. And then history happened from that point on.
Okay. And so what year were you and your wife married?
1975.
Okay.
It was still, Hanson was still pretty small then, but still growing pretty vigorously. And we've certainly seen a lot of changes.
And did you stay in Hanson that?
Yes, I moved 2 whole miles to our first apartment, and that was 75. And then 2 years later, we
Where
bought
was the first apartment?
184 Main Street,
Okay.
down near the Baptist Church on Main Street. And then as economics allowed, and just before mortgage rates went crazy, we bought a house a quarter of a mile away from that at 46 Main Street. And so we've been there, let's see, 77, about 42 and a half years.
That's great.
And so again, we're very much stay-at-home people. We like Hanson a lot, just as previous generations have, so we've continued to stay.
And do you have children?
We do. We have 2 kids, our daughter Sarah and my son David, both married. Sarah and her husband live in Lowell, and David and his wife live in Quincy, both within reach. But jobs and other things have caused them to go a little further outside of Hanson, as lots of us have experienced. Hanson's great in some ways, but most of us, including me, had to commute to somewhere else for a job. In fact, I would say one of the major changes in Hanson is that economically, the large local employers have, in one sense, completely disappeared. Ocean Spray Cranberries is gone, Plymouth County Hospital is gone, Wheeler Reflector is gone, and a lot of small to medium-sized family businesses also went away, like auto dealerships and some other things. And now, as we all know, it's more like larger chain type things. My father's store, Hanson Hardware, after 60 years of family ownership, is now an Ace Hardware, which is a national name. Right. But the good thing for me and for my family is I was able to commute to work and bring my paycheck home to Hanson.
Right, right. Now you have been very active during your time here in Hanson. Can you talk a little bit about some of the various committees and commissions that you've participated in?
Sure. For all of the sort of basic reasons we talked about, my love for the outdoors, I was appointed to the Conservation Commission back in 1981, and I did that for a few years. But then my little daughter, who was very little at the time, one of her first complete sentences was, "Daddy, go to meeting?" And the next day I resigned from the Conservation Commission. But then when kids were grown and a little free time was available again, I went back first on the Town Forest Committee, and then on the Conservation and Open Space, basically doing volunteer things, not being a voting member. But about 4 years ago, I became a voting member of the Hanson Conservation Commission, and I do chair that now. And we are busy, but the things that have changed about Hanson and some things that haven't are that, yes, there's 3 times as many people as when I was born, and a lot more traffic and a lot more cars. The woods are more fragmented. The suburban sprawl has come down to and engulfed Hanson and moved beyond. But fortunately, Hanson is not all paved. We haven't lost all our woods and wetlands. We have some nice ponds and rivers and streams. And all of that needs looking over. We have regulations that we could have used 100 years ago, but we didn't have them. But we have regulations now that protect those resources. We try to work with all the other boards and committees and with state agencies and some federal ones too, to take advantage of the sort of knowledge we have now about the science of protecting wildlife and protecting your drinking water supplies and recreational opportunities that people realize they need, but sometimes they realize too late. Well, it's not too late for Hanson. We've got a lot of good opportunities.
Yeah. Now, you, I know, have been active in the Plymouth County Hospital Reuse Committee, which I'm grateful that you've spent so much, you and the committee spent so much time thinking about the future of that property. But I know that you also grew up across from it, and or on the same street as it, and I'm wondering if you could maybe share some memories you have of that property as a kid, and then your interest in it now.
It would be glad to do that. The hospital, when it was first built, Alan probably shared that it was built on a hill because they thought that was a healthy thing, and they were probably right. But there was also a lot of farmland that they bought, and they used to produce a lot of their own food. You can still see foundations for things like poultry houses and where they raised the pigs, and fields where they raised vegetables and things like that. It's right now, what we enjoyed then was being able to, again, ride our bikes down through to the Cranberry Bog reservoirs to go fishing. And there was no gates, there's no trespassing signs. Everyone trusted everyone else, and it was great just to pass through or pass by. But the fields and things now that are still there but are getting overgrown, we call those like the last remnants of the former New England, the classic New England agricultural landscape. The farms are almost all gone, and one of the previous committees working at the hospital did mow those fields to keep them open. We'd like to do the same. But what we feel the best thing to do now is, for almost 20 years, people looked over and over at all these ideas of what to do with the buildings and what can we do here, how can we develop this. Well, the soil doesn't perk at all up there. It's glacial till, it's like concrete, so it's not good for septic systems. And we talked with many people of all sorts, we in previous committees, and we thoroughly explored a lot of things, and we realized, you know what Hanson doesn't have? It doesn't have a park. It's never had a municipal park. We have a nice little lawn beside the town hall. We have Camp Kiwanee. We've got some other places, but ball fields and whatnot. But we don't have a place to go for a really nice walk other than along the side of the road, which can be kind of dangerous. Good things have been done with the hospital property. For example, the food pantry. It's too bad we need one, but we do have one, and it's a good one. We have the community garden there, which is nice. Probably the most important thing on the top of the hill is the water tower. And whether it's just the one or maybe someday 2 water towers, what more important thing could we get from that area? A big hill on the top of town and in the middle of town? It makes sense. But we'd like that to be complemented with other uses. There's room to put in some improved parking such that you'd be able to go there, and if we restore the lawns that the hospital used to have some really nice areas for informal recreation, maybe events such as a new location for Farmers Market. We used to have that down at the Thomas Mill. At one point in time, there was, I think the Lions Club used to bring a carnival to town. There are a number of things that could use a spot or a venue, if you will, for having them at. We think we can memorialize the heritage of Hanson there too, not just with the historic Bonnie House out of the front and maybe with the relocation of this schoolhouse up there, but between the community gardens and the park area itself, it'll be a great place for things like environmental education programs, a place to go, including playgrounds for probably a couple of different age groups, so that when schools are in session, you don't need to disturb the safety and security of the school environment. There'll be a public place to go for the children. But we're getting close to having some final plans to show to the selectmen and to the town for this. Another thing we're very close to is being able to reroute part of the Bay Circuit Trail, which is something that more and more people are becoming aware of. It's a 200-mile long recreational foot trail, goes from Kingston Bay down here up to Newburyport on the North Shore. And right now, the route of that trail through the middle of Hanson goes right along High Street in Pierce Avenue. We'd like to have it go through the hospital grounds and just be a nice amenity for everybody.
Yeah. Now, your family has been in Hanson for a while. Do you have any stories that were passed down in your family that might be interesting to share?
Well, again, there's quite a range of them.
I'm sure.
One that's, I think, kind of interesting is when my father was 10 years old, they were still living on Liberty Street. And not only his parents, but his grandfather, my great-grandfather Clemons, lived with them. And he was a Civil War veteran. And in the early 1920s, he was not very well. And it came to pass one winter day, they needed a nurse. Of course, no EMTs then, no fire departments or anything. So my father was told to go get the nurse. Well, he was 10 years old, and there was a blizzard outside, and the family vehicle at that time was a sleigh. So my father and there was an older boy next door. They harnessed up the horse to the sleigh. This is in the barn that is now Heidi's Hollow. And they
this is the barn in
that
Heidi's Hollow.
barn right there.
Okay.
And they got the horse to go out in the snow, and they went up West Washington Street and around, because the nurse lived right in the corner. I think it's where the O'Sullivans live now, at the corner of West Washington and Home Street.
Yep.
Halfway there, they encountered an enormous snowdrift, which the local guys were shoveling a big opening through, so they had to wait for that. And then they drove the sleigh around to where, I don't know the nurse's name, but where she lived, told her the story. She got in, and they drove back around to Liberty Street, and that's the way they responded to crises in those days.
Right.
You won't see too many 10-year-old boys driving sleighs through the blizzards these days.
No, you won't at all.
It happened.
Right.
And down the other end of town, about the same time, not the same snowstorm, but my mother grew up on Main Street, down at 1202 Main Street, and her father, my grandfather Keene, he had a car, and there was a lot of technology was going on at the same time. There was also a trolley that ran through town, the street railway, the Plymouth-Brockton Street Railway. Well, sometimes...
And that ran down Main Street?
It ran the whole length of town. We actually started in Brockton, came to East Whitman, stopped, because the railroad wouldn't let them cross the tracks. They were in competition with each other. Everyone wanted the same customers. So people would get out, walk across the tracks, and get on another trolley and go from East Whitman all the way down to Plymouth.
Through Hanson?
Through Hanson.
What was the route that it took through Hanson?
It started, if you start from Whitman, South Avenue up to Perry Avenue, and then onto Plymouth Street, down onto what we now call Whitman Street.
Okay.
And then it turned right onto Spring Street in front of Damien's, the length of Spring Street. Then it turned left at that sharp corner, and then right at the next sharp corner, and went down Liberty Street, past Heidi's, past what now where Shaw's, past to what used to be Walkie's store. It's now 1458 Liquors. Turned right there, went up High Street, the length of High Street, and then at the foot of High Street turned left and ran along Main Street to Bryantville, and then Kingston and Plymouth.
So now, was this an electric trolley?
It was electric. Ran probably for about 25 years, 1900 to about 1925. So people were ready to do better than the horse and buggy, but not very many people had cars yet. And it really fulfilled a need. Kids would take it to school. They would take it to the high school, to go to high school in Whitman. They would take it to go to the elementary schools, to the East Washington Street School, or to the Elzey Thomas School, because by design, it went past those places.
Right.
It went past all the churches in town, and there were turnouts here, and there was a turnout at the Congregational Church on High Street. And it was, I think it cost a whole nickel, but I don't know this except by being told.
Right.
But to get to a story I was thinking of, my grandfather and his family were out for a tour one day, and Grandpa Keene took a sharp left turn when he shouldn't have, not realizing the trolley was right there, and there was a collision. Knocked the car up on its side, and no one was killed. No one was really hurt seriously, but it got everybody's attention. And maybe that's why we don't have trolleys anymore, one of the reasons. But there was a newspaper article about the event, naturally, big event. And the last line of the article was, "The child, Lucy, was not hurt." That was my mother. She was probably about 7 or 8 years old. But the transportation has changed along with a lot of other things about Hanson.
Yeah, yeah. What are some fun or interesting facts that you have about Hanson? You always seem like a wealth of them, so if you could share a few.
Well, probably whether it's interesting depends on what you're interested in. But we've had some, I think, not well enough known facts where Hanson participated, honestly, kind of on the world stage, or sent people to do that.
Okay.
The first minister in town, Reverend Gad Hitchcock, he was in Hanson from 1748 until I think about 1802. But right in the middle of that, we had this thing we called the Revolutionary War. In 1774, 1 year or 11 months before Lexington and Concord, Sam Adams and the other patriots, they were doing their thing, and they decided they wanted a guest preacher to give a message. So they invited Gad Hitchcock from Hanson. And by the way, it wasn't Hanson then, it was West Pembroke, or TUNK. Hanson didn't exist. But it was, he was invited to preach in the Old South Church. And in May of 1774, he gave a very fiery sermon entitled something like The Rule of the Wicked. And General Gage, who was the military governor of Boston at that point in time, was in the congregation. He got up and left. He was not going to sit there and listen to that. And
do you know why he was in the congregation at that point?
well, because it was his job to see what was going on with all these citizens.
Okay.
And it wasn't just a day at church. Sam Adams and all the Sons of Liberty were there. You know, he just, and plus, it was what you did on Sunday, especially if you were a leader. Heaven forbid you not in church on a Sunday. But by probably many people's designs, he was in that church then, and that's why they had Hitchcock preach. And basically, it was like, when the wicked rule, the people mourn, and you can find that, in the Bible. But this offended General Gage, and he famously got up and left rather than listen. And Sam Adams was so pleased, he gave Reverend Hitchcock a new set of clothes. And I think one reason they asked him to come at that time was if the British really were going to maybe make some kind of arrest, he lived far enough away from Boston that he'd be able to get the word and not get arrested. So that was an early warm-up to the Revolutionary War, and Boston was where it was happening, and we all know those stories. A century later, another person from Hanson, actually born right on Liberty Street, was Albert Smith Barker. The Barker name is around here and there, but he, as a young man, went to the Naval Academy, and shortly after that, the Civil War broke out. Well, naturally, the Navy was very busy, and he was on 3 or 4 different ships during the war, including on the Mississippi River. He was on the first ship that captured New Orleans. He was on another ship that went further up the river and helped to capture Vicksburg. That very same ship, one of his shipmate buddies was George Dewey, who was famously the person who captured the Philippines during the Spanish-American War. But Mr. Barker, probably different titles as he went on to do things like, in the 1880s, he commanded a 3-year voyage around the world for the U.S. Navy, making oceanographic observations, representing America in Africa, the Indonesia, which is the Dutch East Indies at that time, China, Korea, Japan. He sailed through what we now call Indonesia a few days after Krakatoa exploded in the 1880s, and saw all the devastation there, one of the greatest explosions in the history of Earth. And he was there, and he was the commander of the U.S. presence in those places, and eventually came back home and continued to make his career in the Navy. In the 1890s, he, along with Theodore Roosevelt, who was Secretary of the Navy, and another very prominent person, basically planned the strategy for the Spanish-American War. And then he had command of a ship and was out in the battle that captured Cuba, the naval battles, I should say. And then finally he went on to be the commander of the North Atlantic Fleet. And he was in charge of the battleships, which were the big things when Roosevelt was president. And Roosevelt was quoted in a biography, says, Barker knows what he's doing. I don't think he ever came home to Hanson. I think he bounced between New York and Washington, D.C. He would retired basically to give after-dinner speeches. He used to share the stage with Mark Twain, for giving entertaining talks and things like that. But we've made some contributions from our little town, and those are some of them.
That's great. Now, you mentioned a term earlier, TUNK, and you had actually once told me about that. I was wondering if you could just explain that word.
Well, in the days before the Europeans, even with the Native Americans here, Hanson wasn't that much of a destination. It was really a place you had to get through to go to somewhere else. And our understanding is the word TUNK means crossway or crossing place. And the big swamp in the south end of town, you had to cross through it to get from the very desirable ponds area in Pembroke, which we call Matakeesit, and the very desirable pond areas in the Bridgewaters, Robbins Pond and down that way, which is called Setauket. And TUNK was the name of the pathway that went through the swamp. And you can look at the oldest maps from the 1700s, and it says Indian Crossway on that little thing. And that place is still there. It's part of the Bay Circuit Trail. It's been built up as the water levels were raised to produce cranberries. But when the state bought all that large property down there and created Burridge Pond, the Burridge Pond Wildlife Management Area, we actually lobbied for this to happen so that we could have access to that trail again. I personally called the Secretary of Environmental Affairs, who wanted to hear from locals, and I told him we want our access back, and he was very happy to help that happen. So in 2002, the state bought that property. It was at that time 1,600 acres. It's larger now because they've added to it. But we still have some pretty nice natural areas to walk through, and Chronicle was kind enough to do a piece on that a couple of years ago. And as I said on that, that's probably been a pathway for a couple of thousand years. It's nice to still have it.
Yeah. Now, you know that this is the 200th anniversary of Hanson, and there are quite a few activities that are planned for the upcoming year. And I'm just wondering if you could reflect on some of the activities or events in your life here in Hanson that particularly stood out in the past, if there's any kind of activities that you particularly enjoyed or were memorable.
Well, some of them were pretty low key because we always enjoyed things like going to Cranberry Cove and stuff.
Well, those are important too.
Well, Cranberry Cove, by the way, is about my age. It didn't exist until around 1950 or 51. And the same gentleman who started Ocean Spray Cranberries, Marcus Rein, donated that to the town because the town had no swimming beach, and then it did. And I think lots of us appreciate that now. I remember the 150th anniversary parade in 1970. In fact, my father-in-law was chairman of the committee that organized most of those things. And
your father-in-law's name?
Russ Howard, Spring Street. And one little side note on that is they said, your granddaughter can be chairman of the 2020 thing. Well, she lives in San Francisco now, so Lauren Fish will not be chairing this. But we all have a chance to reflect on what Hanson's done in the past, but also what we're doing now. Because right now, we are planning in the future of the next century or two. A lot of things that us historical-minded people talk about, they're gone. We have some of the landscape and some of the things we have. The perspective is that can be of history can be seen in the things we talk about, but we also need to be looking ahead. Say, what kind of town do we want it to be in the future? Certainly, we want to keep Cranberry Cove. We want to keep and expand our drinking water independence, from Brockton and other places. And by the way, I haven't heard anyone talk about this, but is there going to be a time capsule?
I think so.
Okay, good. There ought to be. But maybe we should do what Plymouth did. They have a time capsule that's not buried somewhere or tucked away. It's in a big glass case in their town hall. You can see it. A little bit like Lenin's tomb, if you ask me. But there's certain things that would rise to the level of being part of the celebration. Other things give you perspective. And I don't know if this is going to happen, but I heard from someone that possibly the State Department of Conservation and Recreation might at least somewhat restore the use of the fire tower on High Street. And I didn't mean to leave this out, but that's one of the things I enjoyed most as a kid. We would go across it, we would go up and visit with the people in the tower.
And who was in the tower?
At that time, there was different state agencies that had, the names have changed over the years, but they would have one person up there during warm weather from April to probably about early October, not on rainy days, but to literally get out binoculars and look around the landscape for forest fires, smoke. And we would go up there, we'd help them look, and we learned a lot because you could see from there, the top of that tower. It was the highest place in Hanson, and you could see from the Pine Hills down in Manamet all the way up to Blue Hill in Canton. You could see probably 50 miles, and all the high points around there. You could see a lot of the landscape. It made you realize that even if you living in Hanson, you were part of a bigger landscape.
Yeah.
And it was very educational. And I think that knowing where we fit in time and space, we ought to reflect on that now and then.
I think that would be, I would enjoy being able to walk up and take a look at that.
The thing is, the trees have grown a lot taller.
Yeah.
Again, this is the third tower they've had that the trees kept growing. It used to be you could look out our upstairs windows and see Rockland or Franklin Street, and that you can't do that anymore. This is the house.
Yeah.
Now the tower is 90 feet taller, and the trees are relentlessly growing. So I'm not quite sure how that will be dealt with. But whether that does or doesn't happen, it's interesting to see how much, as kids, we learned from that.
Yeah.
And it's again, that's the highest point. Another interesting spot that we still have access to is the lowest spot in Hanson. That could be on a quiz. What's the lowest place in Hanson? Most people don't know. It's the Rocky Run Conservation Area on Indian Head River. You go to State Street and park and walk in along the river. There's a path there. And right where Hanson and Pembroke and Hanover meet, where Indian Head River received a tributary, Rocky Run, it's only 25 feet above sea level. I like to joke that if sea level keeps rising in a few centuries, that's where the marina will be.
Right, right.
But that's a beautiful area to visit. It's one of my favorites, too.
Speaking of favorites, what are some of your favorite areas or places in Hanson, both in the past and now?
Well, we've mentioned the top of the fire tower.
Right.
We've mentioned Rocky Run. We've mentioned the Indian Crossway. I would say that all of the ponds, Wampatuck Pond, McQuan Pond, Indian Head Pond, which are all quite different from each other. They're so different from each other, it's kind of fascinating. But they're great resources and places to spend time, whether it's just sitting in your car looking at them and getting a little peace and quiet, or getting in a canoe or a kayak and going out there, or in the case of McQuan Pond, swimming in it. Yep. But I love to walk along the waterfront at Camp Kewanee and look down into that clear water. It is so clear. That pond is so pure that when it rains, when you get acid rain, it drops the pH about a 1.5, so that if you're a little sunfish that's just hatched from an egg, it's not a good thing for you. But it's so pure that long ago they thought, gee, that could be a water supply. Well, I'm glad they didn't make it one, because it's nice to have it just as a pond.
Yeah. What is the difference you've noticed from when you were a child, those ponds? We've heard some people talk about how there used to be a lot more winter sports on the ponds when they were kids, rather, as opposed to now where...
Yeah, things are getting kind of extreme, and we don't very often have the extreme cold, though. I'll tell you one difference. This is something we'll never see again. I remember being a passenger in a pickup truck driving the length of Wampatuck Pond from the town hall all the way to the other end and back,
When it was frozen over.
like 2 feet thick.
Yeah.
That is not likely to happen again soon. So don't try this. Professional driver, closed course, that sort of thing. But yeah, the area around the town hall, Wampatuck Pond, it was, every winter it was like a scene out of Currier and Ives. You would have kids of all ages there skating, playing hockey. There would be, a little further out, there'd be people ice fishing, through the ice. And of course the town hall's kind of a nice Victorian design, always has been. And it was a real gathering place, and it would get dark and we'd go home. The winter sports have changed though. We still sometimes get snow. We remember from about 5 years ago, we had snow up to the middle of your first floor windows. And that's actually be a good time to get out your snowshoes or skis and enjoy our conservation areas. But other than that, it's just in the winter, keep your wood stove going, stay warm. In the summer, go to Cranberry Cove and cool off.
What are some of the traditions in Hanson that you enjoy?
Well, there's a tradition for every season. I enjoy in the spring getting out in my garden and planting peas and other things just because it's so nice to have the cold weather over. Later on, of course, lots of us still enjoy, as we always did, going to the Memorial Day Parade. That's something that needs to always go on. Shifting on through, something that I think is treasured by me and a lot of my family is on Christmas Eve, the candlelight service at the Congregational Church. That church was the center of where Hanson was started. It was the West Parish of Pembroke again, the parish being the church, and it was a gathering place. The building we have there now is actually the third one, built in 1836, but for many, many years it was the biggest building in town. That's where the town meetings used to be, in that building on those same seats, the same pine, uncomfortable
They've
seats.
saved them.
There's pads on the seats now.
Yeah.
Why would you change it? There it is. But the candlelight service there is always special, and it keeps you centered. Where do our values come from? I think it's largely there.
Can you tell me a little bit more about the Congregational Church in terms of that? You said that's the third building, but the same pews.
Yes. We have the original papers from 1748 when it was started, because the people in the west part of Pembroke found it an awful long ways to walk to Pembroke Center. And this is true all over New England. It's such a characteristic thing. So people within about 3 miles of where this place is now said, we'd like to form our own church. So 32 people started one, and they called the Reverend Gad Hitchcock, who we mentioned, a Harvard graduate. And
did he come specifically to?
He was called
Be a
to
reverend
Hanson for that reason.
For that church, okay.
He never would have found it otherwise, but they wrote him a letter, I'm sure, and sent it on a horse, horseback rider. And he was recruited, he was called, as we say, and the congregation voted to call him. I think he actually was reluctant to come at first, and then he said, well, since you want me so bad, I'll go. Not words to that effect. But over the years, churches originally were not fancy at all. Right. In fact, a lot of them still aren't. But there was no steeple. It was basically a big old barn. And that was expanded and enlarged. But in 1836, they saw their way clear to, I guess, the money from farming and other New Englandy things was enough that they were able to fund this building. They started building in February of 1836. They were done in November. But you didn't have to worry about wiring, no plumbing, no permits to be. They just, farmers and shipbuilders, because there was a lot of that nearby, got together and built a big building, and it's still there. And the wide pine boards, you look at those wide boards in the walls and the floors, and you realize those were full-grown trees in the 1830s, which means they were growing before the Revolutionary War. So the building has, it makes you think about a lot of the passage of time.
Right.
But something that hasn't changed is we're still an independent church, and we still try to do a lot of good things in the community, and the doors are always open, as we say. But certainly we have plenty of other houses of worship in town, and but the values that Reverend Hitchcock and others brought to the table, we think that our little part of America still has those.
That's great. So we have about 5 more minutes. Is there anything else that you'd like to talk about or share in terms of your time here in Hanson or memories that you have?
Well, again, speaking of change, and old-timers including my grandfather used to say, nothing so constant as change. Things you wouldn't notice. When I was a little kid, in terms of wildlife, we didn't have any cardinals. We had no mockingbirds.
Really?
There were no turkeys. There were no beavers. There was very, very few deer. No fishes, no coyotes, no turkey vultures. Some things that we used to have, we don't have so much of anymore. But as farming has gone away...
Can I ask, what are those things that you did have that we don't have anymore?
Bobolinks, birds that like open fields, meadowlarks, and young scrubby trees like ruffed grouse. We have a few ruffed grouse, but very few. Bobwhite, quail type things. Used to hear them all the time, and now you don't. They're gone. There are other birds that live in deep woods that if you have less than 100 acres, they're not going to be there. There's ovenbirds are an example of that. You have a few around, but not very many, because so many pieces of woods now have housing developments in them. They look like the woods from an aerial photograph because there's a lot of trees. But there's those are things that you only recognize if you go looking for them. We have some really good things though too, like the with cranberries having been, the price has gone down so that a lot of old bogs are retired. The good news is we have hundreds or thousands of acres of habitat there. We have the endangered northern red-bellied turtle. They've released those in Burridge Pond like 4 times, and it's a great place for them.
They actually have release parties. I brought my son one time,
Aren't
and
those
we
cool?
got to actually the babies that they had grown and gotten a little bit bigger. We were able to release. Yeah.
Those things are almost extinct.
Yeah.
And now places like that, which are being very thoughtfully preserved, things will continue. But I would just say Hanson is still a good place for people to meet nature and for, yes, you can go commute to your job, or if you work locally, that's excellent, or if you work online, that's super excellent.
Yeah.
We maybe could use more of that as the economy evolves. But we're close to Boston, we're close to the Cape, but we're not in either place. So we have a nice little quiet spot to call home. One thing I heard that you wanted people to talk about is their own house, if you knew. Well, I happen to live in an old house, because back in the 1970s, that's all we could afford. A fixer-upper, sort of this old house. Well, we've lived that for many decades. The nice thing is, actually it starts with the Everson family. There was a farmer by the name, whose last name was Everson, it might have been Levi or something like that, lived in the western part of Pembroke. And when they were going to draw off a line to separate Hanson from Pembroke, it was going to go right through his farm. And he said, whoa, hold it. No, you're not. I want my whole farm to be in Hanson. So the town line, as it's drawn out, goes north to south along the eastern shore of Indian Head Pond, and then it goes sharply east out to Matakeesa Street, and then right along the street and around the corner through Bryantville Center, right down the middle of the street to get to Plymouth Street. And then there's a town bound, and it goes south again. So there's this big triangle of land that was going to be in Pembroke, but it stayed in Hanson, because old farmer Everson wanted his whole farm in Hanson. Well, he had 2 sons, and he carved off a little half acre for each of them and built a house for each of them in the 1840s. And I own one of those houses now. And it's interesting, I've been in both houses, and you can see they started out identical, but over time things change. In our house at 46 Main Street, it was, even though it was a small property, it was a very busy one. There used to be apple trees out back. There was an orchard, and I have a sign that I've saved, and a hand-painted sign. What they used to have out front, it says "Hand-picked Macintosh Reds." So we used to sell Macintosh apples there. I thought that's like folk art, so we'll
Right.
keep that. And people would also do a lot of shoemaking. I've got a list of people and their occupations from 1867 in Hanson, and more than half of the Eversons were shoemakers. Well, there's a little 10 by 10 addition on the back of our house. It's now our laundry room. When we got in there, it was just kind of a little thing. And underneath it, literally on the ground, I found all these leather scraps from shoemaking, along with tools and things. And I found an old ox shoe too. It was shoemakers and farmers that lived there.
And the ox shoe was for the ox
Yes.
that would go.
Everyone's seen a horseshoe?
Yeah.
An ox shoe is different. It comes in two pieces because an ox's hoof, like a cow or a deer, it's split in two. So there's one for each side.
Huh.
It goes down. It's like half a horseshoe, but it's flared out to fit an ox. And I can't imagine how much work it was to put the shoes on an ox, but they would do it. And I've got the shoe to prove it. In the walls of the house, we found something. Because, again, this house is in Bryantville, and just across the line was a destination called Mayflower Grove in Pembroke. It was a summer season theme park. It was sort of like, I don't know, Six Flags only 100 years ago. Okay. They would rent boats on Little Sandy Pond. They would have a summer theater. There were rides, and there were other entertainments there. And the streetcar company we mentioned wanted to create a destination halfway between Brockton and Plymouth, so they'd get more customers, and so they built Mayflower Grove. And their summer theater, they had actors, and inside one of the walls of our house, I was tearing it down to put in insulation, was a poster of there's an actor and actress, and the company name was Perry's Peerless Players. And there was some other information, but it was signed by this as lovingly Mallory and Corinne, and these people with the totally 1918 style hairdos and things. But it was the actual poster from that era.
Oh, that's wonderful.
And the house that we're in, they modified the L so that they could rent rooms to tourists. And we think that people visiting Mayflower Grove, or maybe even the actors themselves, would rent rooms in the house that we now own.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
And it used to be a destination. Now it's just our house.
Yeah. What did you do with the poster?
Oh, we've kept it. It's just undercover someplace. I don't think it wants to be out in the direct sunlight.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure what to do with it. Maybe I'll give it to the Historical Society if you get your museum up by the old Bonnie House.
Have the historical village.
But people think of Mayflower Grove as being in Pembroke. Well, it leaked over into Hanson too.
That's great.
And last but not least, they would sometimes throw things away so that when you go out to dig in a garden like I do, you would dig them up. I've got a collection of bottles. Actually, I thought I forgot it, but I didn't. I have a bottle right here that I dug up out in the garden. And it says, you can look at it, it says, sample bottle, Dr. Kilmer's Swamp Root Kidney Cure, Binghamton, New York. So I don't know if it ever cured anything, but it's fun to find these little trinkets. It's like being an archaeologist in your own property.
That's great.
Between India head pennies and ox shoes and old bottles, it makes you feel like you're just temporarily the steward of a house that someday you'll pass along to someone else. So it's a little bit hard to heat, but we like the house anyway. And it seems like it fits in the landscape. In fact, in conclusion on that, both my wife and I used to go to doctors in Bryantville when we were kids. We'd go past this house. Until the day the realtor took us to see it, we never, ever in our lives took one glance at this house. It fits into the landscape so naturally until we bought it.
Right.
And we're planning to stay.
Thank you. That's
You're
great.
welcome.
Thanks, guys.